Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift into the velvet shadows of royal courts. So if you're tucked in, dimmed the lights, maybe sipping some late night tea, perfect, because we're about to talk about the people who weren't supposed to exist, but always did, the royal mistresses. Now, we're not diving into Netflix drama territory here. This isn't Bridgerton or the Tudors with candlelit affairs that end in fireworks. This is the slow, awkward, very human reality of what it actually meant to be someone's official mistress in a palace, which, spoiler, it wasn't always glamorous. Sometimes it meant silks and diamonds, and sometimes it meant you were quietly poisoned by breakfast wine because another mistress got jealous. So, settle in. Tonight, you'll hear about gilded apartments tucked inside palaces, about women who were somehow both worshipped and despised, and about kings who were so bad at monogamy they invented new job titles for their favorite side girlfriends. And yes, we're going to meet the women who had to smile politely through it all, even while the queen glared at them across the banquet table. Let's start floating through time. The role of a royal mistress, as weird as it sounds, was almost institutional in Europe by the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Of course, kings had always had affairs because, well, power, boredom, and a lot of wine. But by the time you get to people like France's Louis XIV or Charles II of England, the idea of a royal mistress wasn't just a scandal, it was a recognized political role. It even had an official title in France, maîtresse en titre, the chief mistress. Yes, they actually put it on paper. Imagine your boyfriend not only cheating, but giving the other woman a title, an apartment, and her own parade entrance. That's the level of audacity we're talking about. Now, here's the thing. These women weren't just pretty faces lounging around on velvet cushions. Well, sometimes they were, but usually they had to navigate the most cutthroat office politics you can imagine. Because palace walls were basically like high school cafeterias, cliques, whispered rumors, rivalries, but with crowns, inheritances, and occasionally wars riding on them. Being the king's mistress could give you incredible power. You could get your family promoted, your cousins married off to dukes, your enemies exiled, but you could also lose everything overnight. One stomach flu, one wrinkle, one bored king, and suddenly you're living in a cold manor house in the countryside, forgotten. Or worse. Remember Madame de Pompadour? She basically kept her position even after the king stopped sleeping with her by pivoting into being his emotional support bestie, which honestly is one way to future-proof your job. Let's drift back a little further, though, to see how this whole institution even started. In medieval courts, mistresses didn't exactly have job titles. They were just there, unofficial. You'd see them in chronicles written by monks, always described with a lot of sighing disapproval. The king, alas, spent too much time with a certain lady, which is monk code for he was having way too much fun. But behind that moralizing, the reality was that mistresses were often a safety valve for dynasties. Queens had to produce heirs, sure, but many royal marriages were cold, political, and miserable. The king still wanted affection, or at least distraction. So mistresses filled that gap, while queens were expected to grit their teeth, smile for portraits, and continue the breeding program. The palace walls themselves made this situation even stranger. Picture it. Long, echoing halls, rooms with doors that opened into more rooms, servants constantly watching, gossip spreading like wildfire. Privacy was basically non-existent, which meant that mistresses had to move like shadows, always close to the king, always available, but somehow pretending it was all subtle, which of course it never was. Everyone knew. And when everyone knows, the mistress becomes a symbol. not just a lover, but a political figure, a living signal of who's in at court and who's falling out of favor. Take Charles II of England, for example, the merry monarch, and merry he was. He basically turned Whitehall Palace into a frat house with wigs. His mistresses included actresses like Nell Gwyn, who went from selling oranges in a theater to being the king's companion. Nell was witty, funny, and not remotely aristocratic, which of course annoyed everyone at court. She used to joke that she was the Protestant whore, poking fun at the king's Catholic mistress. Yes, the mistresses themselves threw shade at each other. This wasn't some quiet affair behind tapestries. This was a full-on soap opera, and everyone knew the lines. And yet, behind the gossip, these women had to survive. They had to keep the king's affection while dodging rival factions, jealous queens, and constant public judgment. Living behind palace walls as a mistress meant having luxury, but not security. You might get a townhouse, jewels, even a royal pension, but you also lived under the queen's stare, the court's gossip, and the constant fear of being replaced by someone younger, prettier, or more politically useful. Now, let's float over to France again, where things got even more ridiculous. Louis XIV, the Sun King. The guy basically turned having mistresses into an Olympic sport. He had so many that Versailles might as well have had a separate wing just for them. Some were official, some were casual, some were somewhere in between. But the most famous was Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't just beautiful, she was ambitious. She threw parties, she charmed nobles. She basically became queen in everything but title. And for years she held that top spot, until, of course, rumors started that she was dabbling in love potions and witchcraft to keep Louis interested, which, honestly, is peak Versailles drama. Eventually she fell from favor, replaced by someone gentler, quieter. But for a long while, she embodied exactly what it meant to be a mistress behind palace walls, rich, powerful, envied, and constantly balancing on a knife's edge. Let's pause here for a moment, because when we imagine mistresses, we often picture glitter and glam, but the reality was slower, quieter, and sometimes sad. These women spent years waiting for the king to visit, waiting for news of favor or disgrace, waiting to see if they'd be remembered or forgotten. Behind the walls, their lives were a strange mix of luxury and loneliness. They weren't queens, but they weren't ordinary women anymore either. They were stuck in that awkward, gilded in-between, always on display, never truly safe. And that's where we'll leave the candle flickering tonight, before moving into more tales of other mistresses who played the game, and sometimes lost spectacularly.
So, where were we? Right, drifting past the velvet curtains of Versailles and whispering about Madame de Montespan's alleged witchcraft. Because of course, in true 17th century fashion, if you're losing your hold on the king, someone is going to accuse you of satanic candle rituals. It's practically a rite of passage. But let's not leave France just yet. After Montespan's spectacular fall, along came another woman who decided to survive the system in a more flexible way. Madame de Maintenon. She started off as a governess for the king's children, which is about as safe and boring as you could get at Versailles. And yet, slowly, she became Louis XIV's confidant, then his companion, and, rumor has it, his secret wife. From official mistress to unofficial queen. And her strategy? No wild parties, no witchcraft, just endless patience, religious devotion, and the ability to nod sympathetically while Louis droned on about his gout. Honestly, it worked. This was the constant balancing act of mistresses. Some went dazzling and flamboyant, others went discreet and pious. Both strategies could work. Both could fail. Behind palace walls, it was all about timing, mood, and luck. Let's drift across the channel now, back to England, because if France perfected the art form of mistresses, England turned it into slapstick comedy. Charles II, the merry monarch, didn't just have mistresses, he collected them like Pokemon cards. There was Barbara Villiers, who was basically the queen of scandal. She had apartments in the palace, jewels from the king, and children who were openly acknowledged as his. She was also spectacularly rude, constantly insulting the queen to her face, which, in any other household, would have gotten her thrown out. But in Charles's court, it just made her more infamous. Then, of course, there was Nell Gwynn, the actress who made her way from stage to palace. Unlike Barbara, Nell had charm, humor, and an ability to laugh at herself. When people hissed at her carriage in the street, calling her names, she stuck her head out the window and quipped, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." And just like that, everyone adored her again. It was survival by wit. Mistresses in England didn't always live tucked away in palaces like their French counterparts. Some were housed in fancy London townhouses, others in country estates, gifts from the king. But no matter the location, the same themes echoed: luxury, instability, and an endless tug-of-war with the queen. And speaking of queens, let's be clear. Their lives were rarely enviable in this arrangement. Queens had to watch as mistresses glided in and out of their palaces, wearing jewels that technically should have been theirs, hosting dinners that rivaled their own. Some queens fought back, like Catherine of Braganza, Charles II's Portuguese wife, who endured humiliation after humiliation, but still tried to hold her ground. Others just gave up, retreating into quiet piety or their own private amusements. For mistresses, this meant a strange kind of half-visibility. They were powerful enough to influence policy, but never secure enough to relax. The palace walls that gave them luxury also acted as a cage, filled with whispers, judgment, and the constant ticking clock of aging. Let's drift eastward now, to the glittering but equally treacherous courts of Russia. Peter the Great, already a man of appetites, wasn't particularly subtle about his affairs. His court mistresses often came from the ranks of noblewomen or even from his own circle of courtiers' wives. But the Russian court added its own unique flavor of danger: political purges, coups, and sudden downfalls. Being close to the Tsar could mean diamonds one day and exile to Siberia the next, which, let's be honest, is not the kind of retirement plan anyone wants. Later, under Catherine the Great, the dynamic flipped. She had her own series of favorites, carefully chosen, groomed, and compensated. Palace gossip claimed she kept a kind of mistress-in-reverse system, where handsome young men were introduced to her, tested for suitability, and then placed in comfortable estates once she was done with them. Whether or not this was exaggerated by her enemies, the idea itself shows how ingrained mistresses and their equivalents had become in royal life. Behind the palace walls, whether in France, England, or Russia, the pattern was always the same: luxury balanced by danger, influence balanced by fragility. And this brings us to the everyday reality, the texture of life itself. So what was it like, really, to be a mistress behind those heavy carved doors? Imagine waking up in a bed draped in silk curtains, sunlight filtering through painted ceilings, servants tiptoeing in with trays of chocolate or spiced wine. That was the luxury part. Then came the politics. Endless letters to be written, allies to be cultivated, rival mistresses to keep an eye on. You might attend a banquet, sitting close to the king, trying to look casual while every eye in the room burned holes through you. You might spend an afternoon flattering courtiers you secretly despised because their support could keep you safe. And every evening you'd wait. Would the king come to your chambers or pass you by for someone else? It was luxury soaked in anxiety. Jewels glittered, but they were always heavy. Let's pause on that image. A woman in brocade, seated in a gilded room, smiling at courtiers, but always listening for footsteps in the hallway. That's the essence of...
Madame de Pompadour wasn't born into wealth or power. She came from a middle-class Parisian family, educated well enough, clever enough, and ambitious enough to climb. She first caught Louis XV's attention at a hunting party, which sounds like something from a bad romance novel. He was in his coach, she was in hers, and he kept craning his neck to look at her. Subtle. Soon, she was installed as his official mistress. But here's the twist. Louis XV wasn't exactly the most faithful man in the world. He had mistresses before her, he would have mistresses after her. And yet, Pompadour managed to hold her place for nearly 20 years, not because of beauty alone, though portraits of her do show a very polished elegance, but because she reinvented the role. She became his friend, his advisor, his artistic patron. She hosted salons with philosophers, supported the arts, encouraged architecture, and basically made Versailles sparkle with culture. When the romantic relationship fizzled out, she stayed, which in mistress terms is like unlocking the cheat code. She turned herself into indispensable furniture, the kind of person Louis simply couldn't imagine life without. Behind the palace walls, her apartments were decorated with the finest Rococo designs. Her name is even attached to a color, Rose Pompadour. Imagine being so influential that people literally name shades of pink after you. That's mistress power. But again, not all was glitter. People gossiped about her constantly, accusing her of being too controlling, too spendy, too ambitious. Pamphlets circulated with crude cartoons. And yet she endured. The queen tolerated her, perhaps because Pompadour was tactful enough not to rub things in her face, which is honestly a survival skill many other mistresses could have used. Now, let's drift away from France and into a different type of royal bedroom drama, Napoleon's empire. Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't exactly known for his subtlety, whether on battlefields or in boudoirs. His most famous mistress was Marie Walewska, a Polish noblewoman. Their relationship started when Polish nobles basically pushed her toward him, hoping to win favor for their country. So, yes, being a royal mistress could also mean being used as a literal political bargaining chip. Romantic, right? Marie Walewska was young, graceful, and reportedly very kind-hearted. Napoleon showered her with attention, and she bore him a son, Alexander, who would later be recognized by Napoleon himself. Unlike Pompadour, Walewska didn't wield much political power. Her role was more personal, a companion and comfort in a time when Napoleon's marriage to Josephine was falling apart. And behind palace walls, her life was complicated. She had the luxury, the jewels, the recognition, but also the knowledge that her position was built on fragile ground. Napoleon moved on, as emperors do, but Walewska remained part of his orbit, a quieter figure than the glittering French mistresses, but still emblematic of what it meant to live in that strange twilight role. Italy and Spain had their own versions of this system too, though often less formalized. In Spanish courts, mistresses were rarely given the kind of open acknowledgement that the French perfected. Catholic piety made it more of a shadowy business. The king might have a mistress, everyone knew, but it wasn't going to be carved into palace etiquette. These women often lived more precariously, hidden in apartments, shielded by courtiers, vulnerable to sudden exile if discovered. In Italy, during the Renaissance, mistresses blended into a world where popes, dukes, and cardinals all had their own arrangements. It was messy, but also less shocking. In Florence or Rome, nobody was truly surprised when a powerful man had a mistress tucked into some fresco-covered villa. It was practically expected. Still, their lives were fragile, dependent on favors, and easily swept away if politics shifted. Let's pause here and think about the daily texture of their existence. Life behind palace walls for a mistress wasn't just about jewels and banquets. It was about being watched, every move scrutinized. If you wore a new dress, the courtiers whispered about who paid for it. If the king smiled at you at dinner, the queen noticed. If you yawned at the wrong time, pamphleteers might say you were bored of the monarch himself. Imagine walking through gilded halls, the chandeliers glittering overhead, while knowing half the people bowing to you were secretly hoping you'd fall tomorrow. That was the air they breathed, perfumed but poisoned. And then there's the personal toll. Mistresses often aged out of their rules quickly. A new face, a younger rival, a political convenience, and suddenly the woman who once ruled the palace was packing trunks for a quiet estate. Some tried to hold on by pivoting into friendship like Pompadour. Others faded into bitter obscurity, remembered only in gossip. A very few managed to secure lasting wealth or influence, carving out legacies of their own. But behind those palace walls, their stories all shared the same outline. Glitter and power balanced by anxiety and precarity. Always seen, never safe. And as we dim the candlelight on this part, picture...
All right, let's float gently back into the gilded world of royal intrigue. If you've been following along, you know the pattern. Glitter, anxiety, politics, and an ever-present shadow of precariousness. Now it's time to meet a few more mistresses whose lives were, well, instructive in their own unique ways. First, we return to France for the last great love affair of Louis XV, Madame du Barry. Unlike Madame de Pompadour, du Barry was not polished, cultured, or an adept political player. She came from humble origins. Some accounts even claim she was the daughter of a common craftsman. And yet, she charmed her way into Versailles, catching Louis XV's attention in a way that shocked the court. Many nobles despised her. They whispered endlessly about her manners, her background, her audacity. And yet she survived, because the king liked her. That was really the whole job description. Survive if the king likes you. Her apartments in Versailles were luxurious, filled with the finest furnishings. She had jewels, servants, and her own private garden. But she also lived under constant scrutiny. Every smile, every laugh, every new dress was a potential scandal. And when Louis XV died, her world collapsed quickly. Without the king's protection, she became vulnerable, exposed to political enemies, and ultimately was executed during the French Revolution. Which is a stark reminder that life behind palace walls could be both indulgent and perilous. Now let's drift northward to Sweden. Charles X and Charles XI both had royal mistresses, though records are sparse. Life in these northern courts was quieter, less flamboyant, and colder in every sense. Mistresses were often given estates in the countryside, away from the prying eyes of the queen and court. Luxury existed, but it came with isolation. Sometimes this solitude was a blessing. Sometimes it became a slow, lonely exile. Behind palace walls or in distant manors, the life of a mistress always carried a mixture of privilege and solitude. Across the Alps, the Italian states had their own versions of palace intrigue. In Florence, Venice, and Milan, mistresses blended into noble life with astonishing subtlety. They were expected to host salons, manage households, and sometimes even influence minor political decisions, all while remaining technically invisible in official records. Mistresses were diplomats of intimacy, quietly negotiating influence, often unseen but deeply felt. And speaking of invisible influence, let's glide to Russia again. Catherine the Great is perhaps the most famous ruler to make use of favorites, or in her case, male companions who could also be considered mistresses in a reversed gendered sense. Catherine kept men like Potemkin close, rewarding loyalty and affection with estates and military appointments. In return, she received companionship, discretion, and occasional guidance. The balance was delicate. Too much attention in public, scandal. Too little, boredom and resentment. Behind palace walls, relationships were often transactional, wrapped in silk and cloaked in secrecy. Back in England, the story continues with women like Lady Castlemaine and Barbara Palmer. These mistresses weren't quiet, discreet figures. They were loud, proud, and often ruthless. Castlemaine, for example, had multiple children with Charles II. She openly flaunted her influence, hosted grand parties, and threw her weight around court politics. But it came at a price. Hatred from other courtiers, constant rumors, and the ever-present threat of being replaced. The English system, unlike the French one, allowed more freedom of movement. Mistresses often had townhouses, estates, and pensions, giving them a kind of semi-independence. But independence didn't mean security. Every smile from the king was temporary. Every favor could vanish overnight. Now, let's pause on the daily rhythms. Being a mistress behind palace walls wasn't just about politics or luxury. It was a lifestyle of constant attention. Morning routines involved receiving courtiers, checking letters, and preparing for whatever social functions awaited. Afternoons were spent managing estates, fashion, or hosting dinners. Evenings meant either waiting for the king or entertaining guests, all while keeping a delicate balance between appearing influential and not overstepping. Privacy was rare. Walls were thin. Servants whispered. Courtiers watched, and every gesture, glance, or sigh could be interpreted as political maneuvering. Mistresses lived in a world where comfort was never fully safe, and luxury was always laced with anxiety. One common thread emerges: the survival strategies. Some mistresses relied on charm and wit. Nell Gwyn in England made humor her weapon, deflecting criticism with sharp quips. Others relied on discretion and emotional intelligence. Madame de Maintenon kept quiet, cultivated patience, and ultimately outlasted rivals. And some relied on sheer audacity. Barbara Villiers flaunted her power, fully aware of the risks. Whatever the strategy, it had to be constantly adjusted. Palace life was dynamic. A new king, a rival mistress, or even a small misstep could alter one's fortunes overnight. The walls that protected them also trapped them. Behind the heavy doors, they were simultaneously elevated and constrained, celebrated and feared, seen but never fully safe. So, as we dim the candles a little further, imagine the mistresses across Europe. French, English, Russian, Italian, Spanish, all living variations of this delicate, some with cunning, some with charm. All lived with uncertainty. All navigated power, desire, and risk behind walls gilded with beauty and shadowed by danger. And that, my friends, is the essence of what it meant to be a royal.
Take, for example, the French Revolution. Madame du Barry, whose story we touched on earlier, became a stark illustration of how quickly fortune could turn. Without the king's protection, her luxurious apartments, her jewels, her influence, all vanished. Behind palace walls, life had been glittering, luxurious, and perilous in equal measure. But once those walls crumbled, so did her world. She was executed in 1793, reminding everyone that the life of a mistress was inseparable from the whims and protections of the monarch she served. In England, things became slightly more discreet during the Regency era. George IV, who had a series of mistresses both before and after becoming king, often maintained relationships quietly. Mistresses were less likely to hold overt political sway, though they still could influence personal appointments or inheritances. Many were content with pensions, estates, and social prestige rather than power.
The role became more about social positioning than active influence, an acknowledgement that the times were changing. Across Europe, the industrial and social revolutions were also shifting norms. Royal courts became less central to politics. Public scrutiny increased. Monarchs still had affairs, naturally, but the lavish, publicly visible mistresses of Versailles or Whitehall became more of a quiet companion or discreet presence. Behind palace walls, there was still luxury, but the tension was less about court politics and more about maintaining appearances, both for society and for the monarch himself. Yet even in these quieter times, mistresses still shaped lives and history. Some commissioned art, some influenced fashion, and some ensured their children's futures. Madame de Pompadour's artistic patronage, for example, left a tangible legacy that lasted long after her death. Even the less politically savvy women, those who simply survived court life, played subtle roles in diplomacy, alliances, and the cultural life of their times. And of course, the emotional side persisted. Behind the palace walls, many mistresses lived lives of constant tension, longing for attention, managing jealousy, navigating rivalries. They experienced highs of indulgence and lows of neglect. Every smile from the monarch, every token of affection could alter a day or even a life. That delicate balance, luxury mixed with vulnerability, remained central to the mistress experience even as the centuries wore on. One particularly interesting thread is how mistresses managed their legacies. Some secured their position through wit or charm, some through discreet friendships with powerful courtiers, and some through patience and intelligence. Madame de Maintenon, for instance, turned companionship into enduring influence even without formal acknowledgement. She lived quietly, patiently, and ultimately wielded influence that outlasted many of the more flamboyant figures. Another thread is the way they were remembered or forgotten. History often favors kings and queens, battles and treaties. Mistresses, by contrast, exist in that shadowy space, documented but often only in gossip, letters, or court records. Yet their influence, subtle though it may have been, shaped the lives of monarchs, the culture of courts, and occasionally the politics of nations. And so, behind palace walls, from the flamboyant Versailles courts to the quieter houses of later monarchs, the story of royal mistresses became one of survival, adaptation, and paradox. They lived between luxury and vulnerability, power and invisibility, influence and precarity. They were companions, confidants, patrons, and occasionally secret rulers in their own right. As we settle down with this last reflection, imagine the quiet of those.
And now, let's drift into the quieter corners of history, where the lives of royal mistresses reveal themselves not in grand portraits or palace banquets, but in letters, diaries, and whispered recollections. Because while public appearances show the glitter, it's the private notes and journals that reveal the slow, human rhythm behind palace walls. Take, for example, Madame de Pompadour again. Beyond the lavish salons and political influence, her letters reveal a thoughtful, witty, and often anxious woman. She wrote about art commissions, conversations with the king, and the subtle maneuverings of court life. In her handwriting, you can almost feel her navigating the invisible tightrope of influence, always graceful, always persuasive, but fully aware that favor could vanish overnight. Behind palace walls, she wasn't just a mistress. She was a strategist, an artist, a human being living under immense scrutiny. Nell Gwyn in England left fewer formal writings, but the accounts of her contemporaries paint a vivid picture. She laughed at scandal, joked with courtiers, and managed to hold the king's attention while keeping her own sense of agency.
Behind the palace walls, she was constantly negotiating the balance between charm and survival. And her humor wasn't frivolous. It was a carefully honed tool, a way to assert power in a world where women were always measured against someone else's expectations. Letters from lesser-known mistresses showed a quieter, more anxious side. Women who were not brilliant strategists or entertainers often wrote about longing, boredom, and the delicate anxiety of waiting. Waiting for the king to appear. Waiting for news of favor or disfavor. Waiting for their lives to shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently, depending on whims they could not control. These letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal another side of palace life, that of endurance. Mistresses developed routines to cope with the unpredictability of power. They organized their apartments meticulously, maintained close relationships with servants, and cultivated friendships, or alliances, with other women at court. They learned to listen for subtleties in conversation, to read facial expressions, and to predict the mood of the monarch. It was an education in subtlety, patience, and psychology, all behind walls that looked like paradise, but often felt like a gilded cage. Some even wrote about small rebellions of spirit. Madame de Maintenon, for example, recorded moments of quiet defiance, politely ignoring minor slights, refusing to be drawn into petty rivalries, or subtly influencing events without appearing to do so. These small acts of agency were the mistress's version of power, invisible yet effective. The palace walls may have constrained their freedom, but they did not fully contain their intellect, wit, or influence. And even as centuries passed and the overtly public mistress system declined, these private writings continued to reveal the complexity of the role. Some mistresses transitioned into discreet companions, some into patrons of art and culture, and some into quiet advisors, leaving behind legacies that outlasted their time and favor. Behind palace walls, every smile, gesture, and letter carried weight. Luxury was only half the story. Survival, strategy, and subtle influence formed the rest. And so as you imagine the quiet of a palace at night, the soft flicker of candlelight across polished floors, the faint scent of perfumed wax, the muffled echoes of distant footsteps, you can almost see these women, sitting in velvet chairs, writing letters, practicing diplomacy, balancing charm with cunning. Some smiled, some sighed. All waited, waiting for fortune, favor, and the king's attention, while knowing that their position, however glittering, could vanish in an instant. The paradox of the royal mistress is this: power and vulnerability existed side by side. Luxury and anxiety coexisted in every gilded room. Influence was possible, but never guaranteed. And yet many of these women endured, adapted, and left their mark, not always in history books, but in the faint, persistent echo of life behind palace walls. And so, as you settle in, imagine the palace again. Long corridors, the soft rustle of gowns, faint candlelight, and the quiet, measured presence of women who knew that life, luxury, and survival were always intertwined. That is the story of royal mistresses, not just lovers, not just companions, but delicate, clever, enduring forces behind palace walls.